I had always prided myself on being a consummate professional, a woman who navigated the often treacherous currents of the corporate world with a blend of quiet competence, unwavering dedication, and an almost old-fashioned sense of integrity. As a single mother to my bright, inquisitive 10-year-old son Leo, my career wasn't just a source of personal fulfillment. It was the bedrock of our financial security, the tangible result of years of relentless hard work, late nights, and countless sacrificed weekends, all dedicated to building a stable, promising future for us both. For nearly a decade, Sophia Miller, had poured my heart and soul into my role at Innovate Corp, a large, prestigious technology firm with a gleaming modern headquarters that dominated our city's skyline. I had started as a junior marketing analyst, bright-eyed and ambitious, and through sheer grit, talent, and an unflagging work ethic had steadily climbed the corporate ladder, eventually earning the challenging yet deeply rewarding position of senior marketing manager, leading a dynamic team on several high-profile successful product launches. I had earned, I believed, not just the respect of my colleagues and the appreciation of my superiors, but a sense of quiet, hard-won security in my professional life. However, that carefully constructed world of professional achievement and personal equilibrium began to subtly, insidiously unravel with the arrival of Mr. Richard Price. He was appointed as the new vice president of our marketing division, my direct superior, following the unexpected retirement of my previous much-respected boss, a fair-minded and supportive woman named Mrs. Albright. Richard Price, from his very first day, exuded an almost blinding aura of charisma, confidence, and effortless authority. He was a man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in expensive tailored suits with a silver-tongued eloquence, a disarming smile that could charm the birds from the trees, and a reputation carefully cultivated and widely circulated for being a tough, demanding, but ultimately fair and results-driven leader, a visionary poached from a rival tech giant. Initially, I, like most of my colleagues, was cautiously optimistic, even somewhat impressed by his polished presentations, his talk of innovative strategies, and his promises to foster a more dynamic, collaborative, and rewarding work environment. He made a point of scheduling one-on-one meetings with all his senior staff, including me, during which he expressed great admiration for my past achievements, my dedication to Innovate Corp, and his eagerness to work closely with me on future game-changing initiatives. The first discordant notes in this seemingly harmonious new symphony, the first almost imperceptible cracks in Richard Price's carefully constructed facade of professional integrity, began to appear with a subtlety that initially made me question my own perceptions, my own judgment. It started with small, seemingly harmless, yet distinctly uncomfortable personal comments, usually delivered with that same disarming smile, often when we were alone or in the presence of only one or two of his more sycophantic male colleagues. He would compliment my appearance, my attire, in ways that felt a little too personal, a little too lingering, a little too disconnected from our professional interactions. "Sophia, that blue dress is simply stunning on you today. It really brings out the color of your eyes," he'd remark, his gaze holding mine a fraction of a second too long, a subtle but unmistakable shift from professional appreciation to something more appraising. Or, "You always look so put together, Sophia. So elegant. A real asset to the executive floor." At first, I brushed these comments off with a polite, if slightly forced smile and a quick change of subject. I told myself I was perhaps being overly sensitive, that he was merely trying to be friendly, to build rapport in his own perhaps slightly old-fashioned, somewhat continental way. He was, after all, new to the company, perhaps still finding his footing in our established corporate culture. But as the weeks turned into months, the comments became more frequent, more pointed, and the already blurred lines between professional interaction and personal intrusion began to fray, then to dissolve entirely. The working lunches he insisted on scheduling with me, just the two of us, ostensibly to strategize on key marketing campaigns or to discuss my career development path, increasingly veered into uncomfortable, deeply personal territory. He would inquire with a feigned, solicitous concern about my life outside of work, about my status as a single mother, offering unsolicited and often patronizing advice about balancing career and family. advice that always seemed to subtly imply that perhaps my family commitments were a distraction, a potential impediment to my full professional realization. He would then, with a practiced, almost seamless pivot, steer the conversation back to more suggestive, more intimate topics. He would share with a disarming candor that now makes my skin crawl details of his own apparently unfulfilling marriage, lamenting his wife's supposed lack of understanding for his driven, ambitious nature. He would then, with a sly, almost predatory glint in his eye, add, "You, Sophia, you understand ambition. You understand drive. We're cut from the same cloth, you and I. It's rare to find someone so attuned." His physical proximity, too, became a source of constant low-level anxiety. He would find reasons to stand a little too close when reviewing documents at my desk, his arm brushing mine with a frequency that felt far from accidental. He developed a habit of placing a hand on my shoulder or a light lingering touch on my arm when offering praise or making a point small, seemingly innocuous gestures that nonetheless sent a jolt of profound discomfort of unwelcome intimacy through me. His gaze, when he thought I wasn't looking, would often linger on my figure in a way that made me feel objectified, exposed, stripped of my professional identity. I began to dread our one-on-one meetings, my stomach churning with a nauseating mixture of anxiety and a simmering, helpless anger every time his name appeared on my calendar. I started to meticulously plan my wardrobe, choosing more conservative, almost severe attire, hoping to somehow deflect his unwanted attention to project an unshakable aura of professional impenetrability. I tried with increasing desperation to subtly steer our conversations back to strictly work-related topics, to maintain a cool professional distance to erect invisible, but I hoped unbreachable boundaries. But Richard Price was a master of subtle coercion, of insidiously chipping away at those boundaries, of making me feel as though I were the one being overly sensitive, overly formal, perhaps even ungrateful for his special attention, his mentorship. The insidious nature of his harassment was that it was for a long time almost entirely deniable, existing in the gray, ambiguous spaces of lingering glances, subtly inappropriate comments and gestures that could, if challenged, be easily dismissed as misinterpreted friendliness or cultural differences. He was too clever, too experienced in the corporate game to engage in overt, easily provable acts of harassment, at least initially. He was, I realized with a growing, chilling certainty, an expert at psychological manipulation, at creating an environment of pervasive discomfort, of subtle intimidation that left me feeling trapped, isolated, and increasingly desperately alone. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just quit my job. I was a single mother, the sole provider for my son Leo. We relied on my income, on my health insurance, on the stability my career at Innovate Corp provided. And I had worked so incredibly hard, sacrificed so much to get to this position. The thought of walking away, of letting him, this lecherous, manipulative man, drive me out of a company I had dedicated nearly a decade of my life to filled me with a profound, bitter sense of injustice. But the alternative, enduring his escalating, unwelcome attentions, his insidious erosion of my professional dignity, my personal peace, was becoming increasingly, almost unbearably intolerable. I began to lose sleep. My appetite vanished. The joy I had once found in my work was being systematically, cruelly extinguished, replaced by a constant low-level dread, a pervasive sense of being hunted, of being trapped in a gilded corporate cage with a predator who held all the power. The silent struggle had begun, and I, Sophia Miller, was its unwilling and increasingly desperate combatant. As the weeks bled into months, Richard Price's behavior, far from abating in the face of my increasingly cool and deliberately distant professionalism, instead began to escalate, becoming more brazen, more aggressive, and undeniably more overtly harassing. The subtle, deniable innuendos, the lingering glances, the accidental touches while still present, were now being supplemented by actions and comments that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation, no comfortable refuge in ambiguity. He seemed to be testing my boundaries, pushing further and further, perhaps sensing my fear, my reluctance to create a confrontation, my vulnerability as a single mother reliant on this job. He started asking me with increasing frequency and a feigned casualness that did little to mask the underlying expectation to have private working dinners with him, always under the transparent pretense of discussing urgent, confidential project strategies that couldn't possibly be discussed during office hours. When I politely but firmly declined citing my responsibilities to my son Leo or pre-existing evening commitments, his demeanor would subtly shift, a flicker of cold annoyance of thwarted entitlement momentarily eclipsing his usual charming facade. My project assignments, I began to notice with a growing, chilling certainty, would then almost immediately become inexplicably more challenging, the deadlines tighter, the resources scarcer. It was becoming terrifyingly clear, beginning to use his considerable power, his managerial authority to punish my lack of cooperation, my refusal to play his sordid, unprofessional game. During our now dreaded one-on-one meetings in his expansive, intimidatingly quiet corner office, his comments became more overtly suggestive, more personally intrusive. He would make remarks about my wasted beauty as a single mother, about how a woman as attractive and intelligent as you, Sophia, shouldn't be alone. He would then, with a predatory gleam in his eye, lean closer across his large mahogany desk, his voice dropping to a low, intimate, almost conspiratorial murmur, and say things like, "You know, Sophia, I can make things very easy for you here at Innovate Corp. Or very, very difficult. It all depends on your attitude, on your willingness to be a team player, in every sense of the word." The implied threat, the quid pro quo, was as unmistakable as it was disgusting. One particularly harrowing afternoon, while I was in his office reviewing a complex quarterly marketing budget, a budget he had inexplicably and with no prior discussion slashed in several key areas vital to my team's ongoing projects, he made a comment and a gesture that finally irrevocably pushed me past my own considerable threshold for silent endurance, past the point of no return, as I was trying with a forced professional calm to explain the detrimental impact his proposed budget cuts would have on our campaign deliverables. He suddenly reached across the desk, his hand covering mine as it rested on the spreadsheets, his thumb stroking the back of my hand with a possessive, almost reptilian slowness. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about these boring numbers, Sophia," he purred, his voice low, intimate, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You're far too intelligent, far too vibrant to be bogged down by such tedious details. You know, Sophia, if you ever need someone to truly talk to, someone who genuinely appreciates all your many talents, I'm always here for you. You're so much more so, very much more than just another colleague to me, you know. We could achieve great things together. In every department, a wave of profound, visceral disgust mixed with a surge of pure, unadulterated rage washed over me. I snatched my hand away as if his touch had burned me, my heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm against my ribs. I felt a chill, a deep, bone-shattering chill run down my spine. I knew then with an absolute, terrifying certainty that what was happening wasn't just a series of unfortunate misunderstandings or a case of a boss with poor social skills. Richard Price's behavior was no longer just subtly inappropriate or vaguely unprofessional. It was undeniably, unequivocally, and dangerously escalating into overt predatory sexual harassment. And if I didn't do something decisive, something now, it would only inevitably get worse, potentially with devastating life-altering consequences for me, for my career, and for my ability to provide for my son. But I didn't want to make a scene, not then, not there in his office where he held all the immediate power. I didn't want to be labeled as hysterical, as difficult, as overreacting, labels that are so often so easily and so devastatingly slapped onto women who dare to speak out against powerful men. So I bit back the furious, scathing retort that was burning on my tongue. I somehow managed to gather my papers to mumble a curt professional, Thank you for your time, Mr. Price. I'll revise the budget as per your suggestions, and to practically flee his office. My legs trembling, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. That night, after another tense, uncomfortable, and ultimately fruitless meeting with Richard, a meeting where his innuendos had become even more explicit, his veiled threats more palpable, I made a solemn, unshakable decision. I would not let this insidious, soul-destroying harassment continue any longer. My fear, while still a very real and potent force, was finally blessedly being overshadowed by a far more powerful, far more motivating emotion. A cold, hard, and utterly unyielding, righteous anger. I knew that if I didn't find the courage to act now decisively and strategically, things would only inevitably get worse, not just for me, but potentially for other vulnerable women within Innovate Corp. I needed more than just my word against his, more than just my feelings of discomfort and disgust. I needed concrete, irrefutable evidence to prove that Richard Price's behavior wasn't just inappropriate or a misunderstanding. It was a clear, undeniable, and legally actionable pattern of sexual harassment and abuse of power. And so my clandestine and deeply reluctant career as an amateur private investigator, a collector of damning evidence against my own powerful predatory boss, began. Sophia Miller, the dedicated marketing manager, the loving single mother, was about to add another, far more dangerous and far more consequential role to her already overstretched repertoire. Sophia Miller, the secret gatherer of truths, the silent architect of a predator's inevitable and richly deserved downfall. My first and most crucial step in this new perilous endeavor was to meticulously, almost obsessively, document every single instance of Richard's inappropriate behavior. I purchased a small, discreet, lockable journal, which I kept hidden in the false bottom of my handbag. In it, immediately after any unsettling encounter with him, I would record with as much factual, dispassionate detail as I could muster the date, the time, the location, the specific words he used, any physical actions he took, any witnesses who might have been present, though he was usually far too cunning for that, and importantly, how his behavior made me feel. Uncomfortable, intimidated, threatened, disgusted. This journal, I knew, could become a vital piece of contemporaneous evidence, a detailed record of the escalating pattern of his harassment. Next, I began to meticulously save every single email, every text message, every internal company memo from Richard that contained even a hint of inappropriate language, an overly personal comment, an unprofessional request, or a subtly veiled threat. I created a secure password-protected folder on a personal encrypted USB drive, a digital repository for his own damning words. I had noticed, often more careless, more revealing in his written communications, perhaps assuming a level of deniability, or perhaps simply drunk on his own perceived power and impunity. Then came the most difficult, the most ethically challenging, and by far the most nerve-wracking part of my evidence-gathering strategy. I decided, after much agonized deliberation and a great deal of online research into the specific legalities of recording conversations in our state. It was thankfully a one-party consent state, meaning only one participant in a conversation needed to be aware it was being recorded for it to be legal to discreetly, secretly record our one-on-one meetings, particularly those he initiated in his office, or those working lunches he still occasionally, and with a chilling persistence, tried to pressure me into attending. I purchased the smallest, most inconspicuous digital voice recorder I could find, a tiny device that looked like a simple USB flash drive. Every time I was summoned to his office, every time he cornered me in the hallway for a quick chat, my heart would be pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, my palms sweating as I fumbled with feigned casualness to activate the recording function in my pocket or my handbag. The fear of him discovering the device of the immediate and undoubtedly catastrophic repercussions was immense, a constant gnawing anxiety. But the alternative, allowing his harassment to continue unchecked to potentially escalate further, was, I knew, even more terrifying. I had to do this. I had to capture his own words, his own tone, his own insidious manipulative tactics in a way that could not be denied, could not be dismissed as my misinterpretation or my oversensitivity. Yeah, I couldn't allow myself to be bullied, to be groomed into a terrified, compliant silence any longer. The fight for my professional survival, for my personal dignity, and for a safe, respectful workplace had truly and irrevocably begun. And Richard Price, in his arrogance, in his predatory entitlement, had absolutely no idea what, or rather who, he was truly up against. My clandestine evidence-gathering operation, born of desperation and a mother's fierce protective instinct, continued for several agonizing, nerve-wracking weeks. Each day at Innovate Corp felt like a tightrope walk over a chasm of potential discovery. Each interaction with Richard Price, a carefully calibrated performance of professional deference masking a roiling undercurrent of disgust and a steely, focused resolve. The small, discreet digital voice recorder became an almost permanent fixture in my handbag. Its silent, unwavering presence, a small, cold comfort in the face of his escalating, insidious campaign of harassment. The recordings I managed to capture during those tense one-on-one meetings in his office, or during those impromptu corridor encounters he so frequently engineered, were when I listened back to them in the solitary safety of my own home late at night, even more chilling, more damning than I had initially realized. His voice, captured with a disturbing clarity, would shift seamlessly from feigned professional concern to suggestive, intimate purring. Then, when his advances were subtly, politely rebuffed, to a tone-ningring and chilly, almost menacing displeasure. There were thinly veiled threats about my career progression, about the security of my position, always linked with a slimy, unspoken insinuation to my willingness to be more accommodating, more personally appreciative of his special interest in me. He would recount with a disturbing, almost boastful casualness stories of other talented young women whose careers had mysteriously stalled or, unfortunately, derailed because they had, in his words, failed to understand the importance of cultivating strong personal relationships with senior management. The implication was as clear as it was revolting. Beyond the recordings, my meticulous documentation continued. I saved every inappropriate email, every suggestive instant message, every internal memo where he had inexplicably and to my professional detriment altered project parameters or deadlines immediately following an instance where I had politely but firmly declined one of his private dinner invitations, or his requests for me to stay late alone with him in the office to work on a confidential strategy document. I also, with an increasing sense of urgency, began to cautiously, discreetly sound out a few of my more trusted colleagues, women I had worked with for years. Women I knew possessed a strong sense of integrity and a healthy disdain for corporate bullies. I didn't initially reveal the full extent of Richard's harassment towards me. I was still intensely protective of my own privacy, deeply ashamed on some irrational level of being targeted, of being seen as a victim. Instead, I framed my inquiries more generally, asking if they had ever felt uncomfortable around certain senior managers, if they had ever witnessed or experienced behavior that crossed professional boundaries. The responses at first were guarded, hesitant. The fear of reprisal in a corporate environment, especially when dealing with a powerful, well-connected executive like Richard Price, was a very real, very potent deterrent. But as I gently persisted, as I shared in carefully veiled hypothetical terms, some of the types of behaviors I was concerned about, a few brave souls began to open up their stories when they finally emerged, painting a deeply disturbing and depressingly familiar pattern. Anna, a talented graphic designer in a neighboring department, a woman I had always admired for her quiet strength and her artistic brilliance, confessed, her voice barely above a whisper, that Richard had early in his tenure subjected her to a similar, albeit perhaps less intense campaign of unwanted attention. The overly personal compliments, the lingering touches, the private lunch invitations. When she had made it unequivocally clear that his attentions were unwelcome, her previously promising project assignments had mysteriously dried up her requests for professional development opportunities, repeatedly denied for budgetary reasons that never seemed to apply to her male colleagues. She had eventually, disheartened and disillusioned, requested a transfer to a different division, effectively derailing her own career trajectory to escape his insidious orbit. Mark, a senior software engineer, a man known for his blunt honesty and his fiercely protective attitude towards his predominantly female team members, recounted with a grim, angry satisfaction how he had once very publicly and very loudly called Richard out in a team meeting for making a sexist, demeaning comment to a young female intern. Richard, Mark said, had never forgiven him for that public humiliation and had subsequently, through a series of subtle but effective maneuvers, managed to sideline Mark from several key career-enhancing projects. These stories and others like them that began to surface as I cautiously widened my net of inquiry were both heartbreaking and profoundly validating. I wasn't alone. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being oversensitive. Richard Price wasn't just harassing me. He was a serial predator, a man who systematically used his power, his position, his charm to intimidate, to manipulate, and to exploit vulnerable employees, particularly women, for his own gratification, for his own twisted sense of power. And Innovate Corp, either through willful blindness, corporate negligence, or a deeply ingrained culture of protecting its powerful male executives at all costs, had it seemed allowed his predatory behavior to continue unchecked and unpunished for far too long. The evidence I was amassing was becoming a formidable arsenal. The recordings, the emails, the meticulously kept journal, and now the corroborated, strikingly similar accounts from other current and former employees. But I knew that confronting Richard directly, or even going to Innovate Corp's Human Resources Department with this information, would be a high-stakes gamble, a move fraught with peril. HR departments, I was cynically but realistically aware, often existed more to protect the company from legal liability than to genuinely protect the employees themselves. And Richard Price was a powerful, well-connected vice president. They might try to dismiss my claims, to discredit me, to buy my silence with a token severance package and a non-disclosure agreement, or worse, to retaliate against me, to find some pretext to terminate my employment, branding me as a troublemaker, a liar. I needed a strategy. I needed legal counsel. I needed to ensure that when I finally inevitably made my move, I did so from a position of undeniable strength with an irrefutable case that they could not ignore, could not sweep under the corporate rug. Through a trusted friend of a friend, I was referred to a highly respected and reassuringly formidable employment lawyer named Ms. Eleanor Vance. A different Eleanor, thankfully, from any previous distressing narratives. Ms. Vance specialized in workplace harassment and discrimination cases and possessed a well-earned reputation for being a tenacious, brilliant, and utterly fearless advocate for her clients. Our first meeting in her discreet, elegantly appointed downtown law office was a revelation. As I laid out my story, as I presented her with the evidence I had so painstakingly, so secretly gathered, I saw not a flicker of doubt, not a hint of skepticism in her intelligent, appraising eyes. Instead, I saw a dawning professional outrage, a steely, focused determination that mirrored my own. "Sophia," she said when I had finally breathlessly finished my account, her voice calm, measured, but with an underlying resonance of power. "What you have endured and what you have so courageously documented is not just inappropriate behavior. It is unequivocally a clear, egregious, and legally actionable pattern of sexual harassment, abuse of power, and the creation of a hostile work environment. Richard Price is a predator, and Innovate Corp, by allowing his behavior to continue unchecked, is at the very least complicit through negligence and potentially legally liable for fostering such an environment." Over the next few weeks, Ms. Vance and her team meticulously reviewed every piece of my evidence, interviewed Anna and Mark and the other colleagues who had bravely agreed to provide confidential supporting affidavits, and began to craft a comprehensive, legally unassailable case. She advised me to continue with extreme caution my documentation of Richard's ongoing behavior and to avoid any direct, unwitnessed confrontations with him. The plan, she explained, was not to immediately file a public lawsuit, which could be a long, arduous, and emotionally draining process with an uncertain outcome. Instead, our first and potentially most effective move would be to present our meticulously prepared case, our irrefutable arsenal of evidence directly and privately to Innovate Corp's highest levels of leadership, to Mr. Davenport, the CEO, and to the company's board of directors, along with a formal, non-negotiable demand for immediate, decisive, and satisfactory action. This action, Ms. Vance clarified, would include not only Richard Price's immediate termination and a substantial financial settlement for me, but also a commitment from Innovate Corp to implement sweeping systemic changes to their workplace harassment policies, training, and reporting mechanisms to ensure that no other employee would ever have to endure what I and others had suffered. The strategy was bold, confrontational, and undeniably risky, but it also felt right. It felt like the most direct, most impactful way to achieve not just personal justice, but also, hopefully, a broader, more lasting positive change within the company. The predator in the corner office had been silently, secretly stalking his prey for far too long. It was time, finally, to turn on the lights, to expose him and to bring him down. The quiet, desperate hunt for evidence was over. The carefully planned, strategically orchestrated, and morally imperative confrontation was about to begin. The day of the scheduled high-stakes meeting with Mr. Alistair Davenport, the CEO of Innovate Corp, and select members of the company's board of directors, a meeting formally requested by Ms. Eleanor Vance, my lawyer, under the explicit and legally very potent threat of imminent and very public litigation, arrived with a mixture of trepidation, a steely, almost unnatural calm, and a surge of righteous, empowering adrenaline that coursed through my veins. This was it. This was the culmination of months of silent suffering, of clandestine evidence gathering, of gnawing fear, and of a slowly, painstakingly cultivated, unshakable resolve. Ms. Vance and I arrived at the Innovate Corp executive suite a few minutes early. Our demeanor professional composed our meticulously prepared and voluminous dossier of evidence. The Richard Price file, as Ms. Vance had grimly, but not without a certain grim satisfaction labeled it, contained within her expensive official-looking leather briefcase. We were ushered into the main executive boardroom, a large, intimidatingly opulent space dominated by a long, polished mahogany table, and affording a panoramic, almost godlike view of the city skyline below. Mr. Davenport was already there, seated at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, a mask of carefully neutral corporate inscrutability. Flanking him were two senior board members, a stern-faced older woman named Ms. Harriet Prescott, known for her sharp intellect and her even sharper tongue, and a Mr. Arthur Jennings, a long-serving, highly respected, and reputedly very ethical pillar of the local business community. Also present to my initial surprise, though, Ms. Vance had anticipated this was Innovate Corp's own formidable external legal counsel, Mr. Julian Thorne, a man whose reputation for aggressive take-no-prisoners litigation tactics was legendary and deeply unsettling. Richard Price, I noted with a small internal flicker of satisfaction, was conspicuously and pointedly absent. This was not, it seemed to be, a direct personal confrontation with him, not at this initial high-level stage. This was about presenting the irrefutable case against him and against the company's failure to protect its employees to the ultimate arbiters of power within Innovate Corp. Davenport, after a brief formal exchange of pleasantries that did little to dispel the palpable tension in the room, gestured for Ms. Vance to begin. And begin she did. With a calm, methodical, and utterly devastating precision, Ms. Vance laid out our case piece by damning piece. She spoke not with emotional hyperbole, but with the cold, hard, irrefutable language of facts, of evidence, of legal precedent. She detailed the escalating pattern of Richard Price's sexual harassment against me, from the initial subtly inappropriate compliments and unwelcome physical contact to the more overt suggestive propositions, the quid pro quo threats, and the retaliatory actions he had taken when his advances were rebuffed. She presented excerpts from my meticulously kept journal corroborating dates, times, and specific incidents. She played with a chilling clarity that seemed to suck all the air from the room, carefully selected and legally vetted segments from my secret audio recordings of Richard's own voice, his manipulative purring, his thinly veiled threats, his arrogant dismissals of my discomfort. She then introduced the sworn, notarized affidavits from Anna, from Mark, and from 2 other former female employees of Innovate Corp., who had, after much soul-searching and with Ms. Vance's assurance of legal protection, bravely agreed to come forward and detail their own strikingly similar and equally disturbing experiences of harassment and intimidation at the hands of Richard Price. Experiences that had in some cases led to their constructive dismissal or their reluctant departure from the company. As Ms. Vance methodically, relentlessly built our case, I watched the expressions on the faces of Mr. Davenport and the board members transform from initial, perhaps skeptical corporate detachment to visible discomfort, then to a dawning, horrified comprehension, and finally, in the case of Ms. Prescott and Mr. Jennings at least, to what looked like genuine, profound, and righteous anger. Mr. Thorne, Innovate Corp's lawyer, listened intently, his face an unreadable professional poker mask, occasionally scribbling a note, but offering no immediate interruption, no attempt to refute or dismiss the evidence being presented. He knew I sensed that Ms. Vance was not bluffing, that our case was not built on flimsy accusations or emotional conjecture, but on a solid, unshakable foundation of verifiable fact. When Ms. Vance had finally concluded her devastating presentation, a heavy, loaded silence descended upon the boardroom, broken only by the distant, muted hum of city traffic far below. Mr. Davenport, his face now pale, his usual confident composure visibly shaken, slowly removed his expensive eyeglasses, pinching the bridge of his nose as if warding off a sudden intense headache. Ms. Vance, Ms. Miller, he began, his voice low, hoarse, almost unrecognizable from his usual booming, authoritative tone. The information you have presented today is, to say the least, profoundly disturbing, shocking, and if proven to be accurate, and, I must say, the evidence you have provided appears to be exceptionally compelling. It represents a betrayal of trust, an abuse of power, and a fundamental failure of corporate responsibility that I, as CEO of Innovate Corp., find utterly, unequivocally unacceptable. He looked directly at me, then his eyes for the first time holding not just corporate concern, but what looked like a flicker of genuine personal empathy. Sophia, he said, using my first name in a way that felt both disarming and significant, I am deeply, truly sorry for what you have endured. No employee of this company, no human being should ever be subjected to the kind of behavior you have described and so courageously documented. There is no excuse. None. Mr. Thorne, the company lawyer, finally spoke, his voice smooth, measured, carefully devoid of emotion. Mr. Davenport, board members, Ms. Vance, Ms. Miller. Clearly, these are allegations of the utmost gravity. Innovate Corp. has a zero-tolerance policy for workplace harassment of any kind. We will, of course, need to conduct an immediate, thorough, and impartial internal investigation into these claims against Mr. Price. He will effective immediately be placed on administrative leave with no access to company premises or systems pending the outcome of this investigation. Ms. Vance, however, was not to be so easily placated by promises of yet another internal investigation, an investigation that could potentially be manipulated, sanitized, or indefinitely prolonged to protect the company's image. Mr. Thorne, Mr. Davenport, she interjected, her voice polite but with an unyielding edge of steel, while we appreciate your assurance of an investigation, my client Ms. Miller has already endured months, indeed, years of Mr. Price's escalating misconduct. She has already conducted at great personal risk and considerable emotional cost a far more thorough investigation than your own HR department apparently ever deemed necessary. What Ms. Miller requires and what she unequivocally deserves is not just another investigation, but immediate, decisive, and satisfactory action. She then, with a calm, unwavering precision, laid out our non-negotiable demands: Richard Price's immediate, unconditional, and permanent termination from Innovate Corp. A substantial, confidential financial settlement for me, Sophia Miller, to compensate for the emotional distress, the damage to my career progression, the creation of a hostile work environment, and the constructive efforts I had been forced to undertake to protect myself. A formal public, at least internally, to all Innovate Corp employees, acknowledgement from the company of the serious nature of workplace harassment, and a clear, unequivocal restatement of their commitment to a zero-tolerance policy, accompanied by the immediate implementation of new, robust, and independently monitored harassment reporting mechanisms, comprehensive mandatory training for all employees, especially managers and executives, on identifying, preventing, and addressing workplace harassment, and the establishment of a truly independent external ombudsman to whom employees could safely and confidentially report any future concerns without fear of retaliation. The negotiations, conducted primarily between Ms. Vance and Mr. Thorne over the next 48 tense, nail-biting hours, were intense, complex, but ultimately surprisingly swift. Faced with the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence, we had presented the potential for a hugely damaging, very public lawsuit. The corroborated testimonies from other victims and the clear, united outrage of at least two of their most influential board members, Mr. Davenport and the Innovate Corp leadership, had little real choice but to concede on almost all our key demands. Richard Price was indeed terminated from Innovate Corp. His dismissal effective immediately, his lucrative severance package. I was privately, and with no small measure of satisfaction, informed by Ms. Vance, significantly curtailed due to the gross misconduct clause in his executive contract. I heard through the relieved whispers of my former colleagues, escorted from the building by security that very same afternoon, his career at Innovate Corp, and likely his reputation within the wider tech industry, in utter ignominious ruins. The predator in the corner office had finally decisively been dethroned. I received a substantial confidential financial settlement, a sum that, while it could never truly compensate for the months of fear, anxiety, and emotional distress I had endured, nonetheless represented a tangible acknowledgement of the wrong I had suffered and provided a significant measure of financial security for myself and Leo as I contemplated my own professional future. And perhaps most importantly, for the long-term well-being of other employees at Innovate Corp, the company did indeed, publicly at least internally, reaffirm its commitment to a zero-tolerance harassment policy and began the immediate visible implementation of many of the systemic changes Ms. Vance and I had demanded. New training programs, a revamped reporting system, a commitment to fostering a more respectful, inclusive, and accountable corporate culture. My personal battle was won. The silent, solitary struggle had culminated in a resounding, if hard-fought, victory. But the war against workplace harassment, against the abuse of power, against the insidious culture of silence that so often protects perpetrators and further victimizes their targets, was, I knew, far from over. My journey, however, had perhaps in some small way contributed a crucial voice, a courageous example to that larger, ongoing fight. The aftermath of Richard Price's sudden, unceremonious departure from Innovate Corp and the subsequent, albeit discreetly managed, public acknowledgement within the company, at least, of the serious nature of his misconduct, was for me, Sophia Miller, a period of complex, often contradictory emotions. There was undeniably a profound, almost giddy sense of relief, the lifting of an immense, suffocating weight that I hadn't fully realized I had been carrying for so many exhausting months. The daily dread of encountering him in the hallway, the sickening anxiety before every scheduled meeting, the constant hyper-vigilant awareness of his predatory gaze, all of it blessedly gone. I could breathe again. Truly breathe in my own workplace. There was also a quiet, deeply satisfying sense of vindication of justice, however imperfect, having been served. He had not gotten away with it. His power, his arrogance, his manipulative charm had not, in the end, been enough to shield him from the consequences of his despicable actions. My courage in speaking out, in meticulously gathering the evidence and facing him down, had mattered. It had made a difference. But alongside the relief and the vindication, there was also a lingering sadness, a sense of disillusionment that I knew would take a long time to fully dissipate. The experience had in many ways irrevocably changed me. My inherent trust in institutions, in the inherent goodness of people in positions of power, had been severely, perhaps permanently eroded. I had seen firsthand the insidious ways in which power could corrupt how easily a corporate culture could become complicit through either active participation or passive negligence in enabling and perpetuating abuse. The reactions of my colleagues in the weeks and months following Richard's dismissal were varied and often quite telling. Many, particularly the women, approached me privately, their voices hushed with a mixture of admiration for my courage and a shared unspoken understanding of the toxic environment Richard had fostered. Some even tearfully shared their own previously undisclosed uncomfortable encounters with him, their relief at his departure palpable. These quiet, heartfelt acknowledgments were in many ways more meaningful to me than any formal apology from the company. Others, a smaller but still significant contingent, particularly some of the older, more entrenched male managers who had perhaps benefited from Richard's patronage or who simply subscribed to an outdated boys will be boys mentality, remained conspicuously silent, their demeanor towards me, cool, distant, almost resentful, as if I were somehow to blame for the unfortunate disruption his departure had caused. Their attitude was a stark, sobering reminder that the fight for a truly respectful, equitable workplace was an ongoing generational battle, not one won with a single isolated victory. My own future at Innovate Corp, despite my reinstatement and the company's public expressions of support, felt uncertain. While Mr. Davenport and the board had on paper at least done the right thing, I couldn't entirely shake the feeling that I might forever be viewed by some within the organization as the woman who brought down Richard Price, a troublemaker, a whistleblower, however justified my actions had been. The corporate world I knew often had a long, unforgiving memory. And so, after much soul-searching, after many long conversations with Tom, my ever-supportive now ex-husband from a previous life story, but in this narrative, my steadfast, loving current husband who had been my rock throughout this ordeal, and with my son Leo, whose future well-being was always my paramount concern, I made another difficult but ultimately empowering decision. About 6 months after Richard Price's termination, after I had overseen the successful implementation of several of the new anti-harassment training programs, I had advocated for ensuring my victory had a lasting positive impact beyond my own personal justice. I chose to resign from Innovate Corp. It wasn't a decision born of bitterness or fear or a desire to flee. It was a decision born of a newfound hard-won clarity. A recognition that I needed a fresh start, a new professional environment where I could rebuild my career, my confidence on my own terms, unburdened by the lingering shadows of Richard Price's toxicity and the company's initial painful failure to protect me. I used a portion of my financial settlement to take some time off to heal, to reconnect with Leo, to rediscover my own passions. And then, with a renewed sense of purpose, I channeled my experiences, my hard-won wisdom into a new career path. I became a certified workplace ethics and harassment prevention consultant, starting my own small independent firm dedicated to helping other companies, other organizations create truly safe, respectful, and equitable work environments. I shared my story anonymously at first, then with increasing confidence in workshops and seminars, using my own painful journey as a powerful cautionary tale and as an inspiring example of how one person armed with courage, with evidence, and with an unshakable belief in justice can indeed fight back, can indeed make a profound, lasting difference. My life after the storm of Richard Price was irrevocably changed. The scars, though faded, remained a permanent reminder of the darkness I had faced, of the battles I had fought. But so too did the strength, the resilience, the wisdom forged in that fire. I had learned in the most brutal personal way imaginable that standing up for yourself, for your dignity, for what is right, isn't always easy, isn't always safe, isn't always popular, but it is always, always worth it. And in doing so, you not only protect your own integrity, your own soul, you often, in ways you may never fully realize, inspire countless others to find their own voice, to fight their own battles, to help build a world where predators like Richard Price can no longer thrive in the shadows, preying on the vulnerable, silencing the just. And that I came to understand was a victory, a redemption far greater, far more meaningful than any personal or professional triumph could ever be. My quiet, determined fight had not just saved myself. It had, I hoped, contributed in some small, vital way to a larger, more universal chorus demanding justice, respect, and an end to the silent suffering.